Guten Abend, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, zur diesjährigen Panofsky Lecture am Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte. Vor knapp 100 Jahren, 1929/30, tobte in Hamburg der Faksimile-Streit. Protagonisten waren zunächst einmal Max Sauerland, Direktor des Hamburger Museums für Kunst und Gewerbe, und Karl-Georg Heise, Leiter des Museums für Kunst- und Kulturgeschichte in Lübeck. Dieser, Heise, setzte in seiner Museumspräsentation auch auf Abgüsse, auf Reproduktionen von Kunstwerken. Jener, Sauerland, sah dadurch den Wert der Originalkunstwerke in Gefahr. Die Diskussion über Kunstwerk und Reproduktion entfaltete sofort eine ungeahnte Dynamik mit zahlreichen Beiträgen. Letztlich wird man noch Walter Benjamins Buch von 1935 zum Kunstwerk im Zeitalter seiner technischen Reproduzierbarkeit in dieser Linie sehen dürfen. Schon 1930 schaltete sich jedenfalls auch Erwin Panofsky in die Auseinandersetzung ein. Und wie immer bei Panofsky hebt er das Problem auf eine neue Ebene. Ich zitiere: Ich glaube, dass der Faksimile-Reproduktion sowohl von ihren Feinden als auch von ihren Freunden Unrecht geschieht, wenn ihr die Absicht unterstellt wird, das Original unmittelbar zu ersetzen. Der objektive Sinn der Faksimile-Reproduktion besteht darin, eine gute Reproduktion zu sein. Zitat Ende. Panofsky betont die spezifische reproduktive Optik und die eigenen stilistischen Grenzen und Möglichkeiten der Reproduktion. Beides nochmal Zitate. Anders gesagt, Panofsky betont nicht nur die täuschende Substitution der Reproduktion, sondern deren eigene Materialität und Medialität. In dieser liege die besondere Seherfahrung und der Wert dieses Mediums. Auch wenn die Personen, die mit der Panofsky-Professur am Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte ausgezeichnet werden, nicht unmittelbar mit den Forschungen Erwin Panofskys zu tun haben müssen, verweist Panofskys Beitrag zum Faksimile-Streit von 1930 doch erstaunlich auf eine zentrale These des heutigen Vortrags voraus. Ein Vortrag, der die digitale Materialität von Cybermonumenten und deren Bedeutung für die heutige virtuelle Erinnerungskultur zum Thema hat. Als Panofsky-Professor haben wir dieses Jahr Andrea Pinotti gewinnen können. Pinotti ist Professor für Philosophie und Ästhetik an der Università di Studi von Mailand und arbeitet im Zwischenbereich von Philosophie, Ästhetik, Kunstgeschichte und Wissenschaftsgeschichte. Es ist genau dieser interdisziplinäre Zugriff, den wir auszeichnen, ein Zugriff, der im Übrigen einen weiteren interessanten Bezug zum frühen 20. Jahrhundert eröffnet, nämlich zu den Diskussionen um eine echte Kunstwissenschaft, also eine Auseinandersetzung mit Kunst, Kunstgeschichte, die Einzelwerke und übergreifende ästhetische Fragen und Theorien verbinden wollte. Pinotti hat 1993 eine These di Laurea über Wilhelm Worringer verfasst und wurde 1998 promoviert mit einer Arbeit zu den Stilkonzepten der frühen Kunstgeschichte, die unter dem Titel Il corpo dello stile, storia dell'arte come storia dell'estetica a partire da Semper Rigel Wölflin erschienen ist. Er hat danach Bücher über Walter Benjamin und Abi Warburg geschrieben. Der Bogen zum Hamburger Faksimile-Streit schließt sich auch auf diesem Weg. In den letzten Jahren beschäftigt er sich intensiv mit den Rahmenbedingungen, den Dispositiven, könnte man sagen, visueller Kultur. Ein Buch zum Bild von Narziss bis zum Virtuellen erscheint demnächst auch auf Englisch. Dieses Jahr nun hat Pinotti ein Buch vorgelegt zu Monumento und Paradosso della Memoria. Übersetzen lässt sich das Wortspiel vielleicht als Nicht-Monument, ein Paradox der Erinnerungskultur. Und hier setzt auch sein Vortrag heute Abend an: Cyber Monuments, Memorialisation Today between Virtual and Augmented Reality. Bevor ich Andrea aber nach vorne bitten will, will ich unserem Förderverein, der Conjuncta Florescit ganz herzlich danken. Nur deren Unterstützung ermöglicht uns, dass wir die Panofsky-Professur am Zentralinstitut haben. Und nicht nur den Panofsky-Professor oder die Professorin finanziert unser Förderverein, sondern auch noch die Möglichkeit, einen jüngeren Fellow einzuladen, der im jeweiligen Themenbereich des Professors oder der Professorin arbeitet. Das ist dieses Jahr Mirjana Mitrovic von der Fakultät Gestaltung der Universität der Künste Berlin, der ein Projekt verfolgt zu hybride Welten, Flanieren zwischen analogen und digitalen Realitäten. Schön, dass Sie auch hier sind, Frau Mitrovic. Dank schließlich auch an das ganze Team des ZIs, das den Abend heute in unserem Lesesaal ermöglicht hat. Erinnern will ich schließlich noch ganz kurz daran, dass wir nicht heute den Vortrag diskutieren, sondern morgen um 11 Uhr in unserem Seminarraum 110. Alle Interessierten sind herzlich eingeladen zu kommen. Jetzt aber sind wir gespannt auf deinen Vortrag, lieber Andrea, und ich wiederhole den Titel nochmal: Cyber Monuments, Memorialisation Today between Virtual and Augmented Reality. Andrea.
Vielen Dank, Ulrich, für diese freundliche Einleitung. It's a great honor for me to speak as a Panofsky professor in front of you today, and I am also very grateful to the Zentralinstitut and the team for having me here as a guest in this wonderful institution. So, during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, we got used to hearing and using ourselves the term virtual on a daily basis. We had virtual meetings, virtual lessons, virtual galleries, visiting the Louvre at home, as this advertising says. So virtual, the term has become a buzzword, an umbrella term, to cover a wide range of meanings: remote, extended, augmented, online, digital, actually producing a pretty blurred semantic area. Actually, I think that a terminological but also conceptual clarification is needed to avoid confusion. The proper virtual, in the strict sense of the term, should be considered one of the manifold inflections of our way of dealing with with distance, with the experience of distance and with the multifarious human strategies to conquer distance. So in this effort of conquering distance, which deserves treatment from an anthropological point of view, from the point of view of the theory and history of media, these technologies, the virtual, the augmented, the online, the digital, the remote, the extended, should be considered within a wider constellation of what we could call distal prostheses. So prostheses that the human being has developed in order to manage and to negotiate the experience of distance. So I will try to illustrate my point comparing two of these typologies: the virtual, precisely, but only in the strict sense of the term, and the augmented. In both cases, we have to deal with digital entities produced by relatively new technologies. Both are often brought together under the label, the generic label virtual, but actually they are definitely different objects, triggering different experiences, to some extent opposite experiences. In order to explain this opposition, this polarity, I will show you two paradigmatic examples of how these technologies work. two examples which are not directly related to my specific topic, but they can serve as an introduction, as a premise. First example is augmented reality as offered by an application that you can download on your smartphone, which is an IKEA app place.
Our new augmented reality app. Built on Apple's new AR kit, you can easily place true-to-scale 3D models of IKEA furniture in your place. Scan, browse, select, move, and place. So that could mean less of this.
So in augmented reality, what happens is that you call the digital object here. You have the digital object pop up, appear as a kind of epiphany in your own environment, which remains visible. You can perceive your own environment, and you augment this space, this actual ordinary space, with a digital object. Pretty different the situation when we have to deal with virtual environments. Let's see what happens in a virtual environment in the strict sense of the term. You have the split screen, so you can see from the outside the user and what he sees from the first person point of view. The lift has taken him up to top of a skyscraper. Lot of people.
I feel like I'm just going to tip over.
You've got to get to the end.
Oh, I can't do it. Oh my goodness me.
If you're brave, you jump off the edge.
They laugh, but he had a very strong visceral reaction. In spite of the fact that these football players are trained to control their reactions in a physiological sense, muscles, nerves, a conflict is triggered, which is both perceptual and cognitive. You know, he knew very well that he was safe in that room, surrounded by his friends, that the plank on the floor was not a danger, was not threatening his life, but nevertheless, the audiovisual system teleporting him to the top of a skyscraper made him feel in danger. So he had visceral reactions, and this is just a clip of this experience, but many of these football players couldn't take a step on the plank, in spite of the fact that they knew that that was fictional, that was not real, that was virtual. So when you wear a headset in virtual reality, you are actually isolated from your own world, even from your own body. If you go like this, you do not see your own hand. And you are teleported. It's a kind of actualization of the ancient miracle of the saints by location. Your St. Francis is here, and at the same time is in another place with another saint discussing theology. Why am I speaking of opposition? Why am I speaking of polarity in these two cases? Because even if it's even difficult to pronounce it, at least for a non-native speaker as I am, immersion and immersion. Phonetically, they sound almost the same, but actually they have a very peculiar distinction in themselves. So in AR, as you have seen from that IKEA advertising trailer, you have the immersion of the object, the digital object, which comes here in order to augment your own very personal space. Whereas in virtual reality, you immerse yourself, you dive, you plunge into a totally alternative electronic and synthetic world. You go there, you go virtual. From the point of view of the genealogy in media history, these new technologies, they certainly do not come out of the blue. They are prepared by a very long history in techniques, in technologies. You could even go as back as to Paleolithic caves, in a way, because if you think of the Paleolithic caves of the Upper Paleolithic as 360 environments which surround you with pictures, you could have an example of a pre-digital immersive environment. But certainly the most recent relatives of these new technologies are phantasmagoria for augmented reality and stereoscope for virtual reality. In phantasmagoria, ghostly apparition popped up, haunting the audience, but the audience was sharing an intersubjective space. They could see one another. Whereas in the stereoscope, the user is very similar also in the posture, in the attitude, with nowadays users of VR headsets, because they isolate themselves in a solipsistic way and they are kind of teleported to another space, to another world. So after this necessary premise on this polarity in these new technologies, let's move to the core of my talk today, namely cyber monuments in VR and in AR. But actually, again, a second premise is needed. Because as you very well know, monument, Denkmal, Mahnmal, interesting nuance in German. The very term is characterized by a polysemic density. It can mean landmark, highlight what I need to visit of a city or a territory, but also a building or a structure or a site which is of a historical importance or interest. Or again, monument in a metaphorical way as an example which is enduring, which is memorable. Proust is a monument of French literature. And finally, monuments as intentional memorials, a statue, a building, or another structure erected in order to commemorate a notable person or event. This is the specific meaning I want to focus on. Gewollte Denkmale, as Alois Riegel would put in his Denkmalkultus. For example, in a paradigmatic way, the cenotaph, literally the void tomb erected in London for the victims, soldiers of the First World War. So let's start with the first family of cyber monuments in the sense of cyber memorials, the ones realized in virtual reality. Speaking of cenotaphs, virtual reality can offer us the realization of unrealized projects. For example, the famous cenotaph for Newton designed by the visionary architect Étienne-Louis Boullée. In 2021, the Parisian studio Femme Fatale realized this cenotaph in VR, allowing the user to feel present in front and within this building. a preliminary remark, it is very difficult to speak of VR environments showing them on a screen, because in this case, you actually destroy the very first property of a virtual environment, the fact that in the headset, when you wear the headset, you are plunged in a 360 environment, meaning that you don't have frames. If you see it on a screen, you have the framing device, which is a very important characteristic for paintings, for photographs, for cinema, for videos. The delimitation of what is picture and what is not picture. It has advantages and disadvantages. If you are watching a horror film and you are becoming too emotional, if you want to convince yourself that it's just a movie, what do? You focus outside the image. You go off image. You look at the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall or the toilet sign. It's just a movie. I am in a movie theater. Where you are in a headset, you cannot go off image, because any way you turn your eyes and your head, you cannot see but images. There is no off image. So we should all wear a headset now in order to understand this kind of environment. It was not possible, so we have to imagine it. Unrealized monuments, but also realized monuments. For example, this VR work takes you into the so-called Sixtine Chapel of ancient Egypt, the tomb of Nefertari, the great queen, the tomb in the Valley of the Queens in Egypt. So you can step inside the tomb, you can immerse yourself in the story of its art, history, construction. You can also trigger interactive elements which give you further information on images, pictures, symbols that you can find there. It's a highly sophisticated photogrammetry. It's a scanning, and the level of the details is extremely sophisticated. So let's see this guy. This is a clip of an experience. In the Senator for Newton, you saw the trailer, the official trailer. Here you have a first-person experience of this tomb, which is not very sophisticated.
This is an amazing experience. Did I mention it's free to play as well? There's no excuse now not to go to Egypt, because you can come here. Kind of a good excuse not to go to Egypt, I suppose. 100% less scorpions.
The painting on the lintel shows a beautiful image of the goddess Ma'at. She is spreading her protective wings over the entrance to the Queen's burial chamber. Ma'at was the goddess of truth, justice, and order. Ma'at is usually identifiable by the feather she wears on her head.
So you saw the image, the digital image of the controllers in the visual field. So it is true that if you go like this, you cannot see your own hands. But it is true that in some devices, you can have digital proxies of your own hands in the form of digital gloves, for example, or controllers, helping you in navigating in the virtual environment. Another experience, the Anne Frank house, the secret annex. This is a VR experience promoted by the Anne Frank Foundation. And this again is an experience.
Okay, so how do we move? Ah,
you see the hand.
There we go.
Again, an interactive environment.
Our hiding place has now become a true hiding place. Mr. Kugler, you see, thought it would be better to place a cupboard in front of our door. But then, of course, a cupboard on hinges that can open like a door. Now, when we want to go downstairs, we have to duck first, then jump. After 3 days, we were all walking around with bumps on our foreheads, because everyone kept banging their heads against the low doorway. Peter then made the door frame as soft as possible by nailing to it a cloth full of wood shavings. We'll see if it helps.
Oh, that's a smart one.
Straight across from the door, a steep set of stairs. To the left, a little hallway and a room, which is to be the Frank family's living room and bedroom.
Okay. It's very small, that's for sure. Oh, wow.
Of course, we are never allowed to look out the window or go outside.
So the idea is that you take the user inside the secret annex of Anne, and you have him or her experience from in the first person what might be to be closed in such a small space to trigger empathy, we could say. And again, this is an experience. I stress this notion because when I speak of experience, I am speaking of a first person experience in a phenomenological sense. This means that we approach one of the properties of the virtual, which is the fact that the virtual is a potentiality. Every time you put on your headset and you repeat this experience, you have it in a different way. You actualize this experience in a different way. And this is something which collapses on ordinary perception. So what happens in the headset is that you give to yourself the visual angle. Just like in ordinary perception, I am here, I am looking at you, in front of you, but for a strange reason, I could decide to spend the rest of my talk looking at her. This is something that you can do in a virtual headset. So the visual angle is not prescribed as it happens for some paintings, especially the ones which are constructed from a very rigorous, for example, in perspective, in linear perspective, or in cinema, which is a prescription of the posture of the observer, of the spectator. It's the technique of the observer, as Jonathan Crary puts it, meaning observation in the sense that you watch, you look at, but you observe a rule also, you observe a regime. In the virtual environment, you give this visual angle to yourself, which also can create anxiety. Because if you have a movie, if you have a painting, the framing device is a tyranny of the author, an imposition of the producer of the image. If Hitchcock has decided that in the shower you should just see the victim but not the killer, you can go to the screen and move the screen in order to focus on the killer. The killer will remain out of your sight forever. And this happens also in paintings and in photographs. If Edgar Degas has decided to cut in a sadistic way the legs of his characters or his dancers, you cannot go to the painting and go like this to move the frame in order to see what Edgar Degas has decided not to show you. But in virtual reality, you have the impression, it promises in a way. This is also part of the ideology of virtual reality, of the rhetorics of virtual reality. It promises you to emancipate from the tyranny of the producer, because you can give to yourself the perspective, you can give to yourself the visual angle, just like in ordinary perception. Memorials in VR can be designed, as we have seen, on building on previous projects, realized, unrealized. or promoted by institutional subjects, Anne Frank Foundation, but they can also be produced and arranged in a bottom-up way, in a grassroots way, by the user themselves. This, for example, is a 9/11 memorial that has been produced in one of the most famous, one of the first virtual worlds, Second Life. In Second Life, you can have access through your browser, but you can also have access through the virtual headset. You can walk, you can see little altars, flowers, you can read the names of the victims, you can encounter other visitors, their avatars, at least, their digital proxies representing them, and you have yours in this virtual world. So it is, in a way, a shared intersubjective space. These are all 360 degrees environments, and this is a property they all share. As I said, you can decide what vantage point, what visual angle to choose, like in ordinary, normal perception. But actually, we would make a mistake if we spoke of these technologies in the singular, because according to the different headset that you use and the different program that you activate, you can have access to pretty different experiences. The terminology is imported from robotics. It says, it speaks of degrees of freedom. What does it mean? That in the cenotaph for Newton, your freedom is limited. You can just turn your head around 360. You can focus on the tomb of Newton, on the library, on the fire, on the staircases. But the deambulation is mandatory. You cannot approach or distantiate yourself from the digital objects. The only thing that you can do is turn around your head and your eyes. On the contrary, in memorials like the 9/11 that we have just seen, you have the liberty to move in a kind of special translation. You can move from one point to the other. You can approach things in this environment. You can step back. So it's not just a 360, but you have the freedom to move in the environment. And this is called 6 degrees of freedom, whereas the first one, in which you can just turn your head around, is called 3 degrees of freedom. Third typology, you can move, you can displace yourself, you can teleport yourself, either because you actually walk in the room, or because you have a controller, like in the case of the tomb of Nefertari, and you can teleport yourself from here to there, or you can open the door or can descend the staircase. But the third typology also offers you a possibility of interaction with digital objects. So in the case of Anne Frank, you can pick up a book from the desk, you can open doors, you can do things. Interaction is a very problematic, tricky concept. It has been saluted as, again, an emancipation, because in an interactive environment, the user becomes an author. The distinction between the producer of the image and the spectator, the observer, is blurred. Because in interactive environments, you contribute to the construction of meaning, to the narration, to the development of the story. But actually, at least as far as the actual technology and its advancement are concerned, this liberty is what I call liberty on parole. Is a kind of limited liberty, because it is true that you can choose between among different options, but be these options 10, 10,000, 10 millions, they have always been predetermined by the programmer. So you have the liberty to choose, but you have the liberty to choose within a predetermined set, a kind of a priori. It's a transcendental of the software in a way, if you wish to put it in a philosophical way. And you cannot change the matrix, you cannot change the code. That would be actually a possibility of intervening in a personal, original way. This is the scheme from robotics, suggesting the names, the specific names for the possible movements that you can be allowed to execute in a virtual environment. And as I said, some of them are more limited than others. Second family, cyber memorials in AR. Here, the technology is much cheaper, much more accessible, because it is something that you can access through a simple smartphone. You don't need a headset. As I said, in these cases, you have a digital object, an epiphany of the digital object popping up, but the world around you remains the ordinary world that you would perceive even if you were not dealing with an augmented space. This is a first example, Stonewall Forever Memorial. Stonewall Inn was a historical bar in Manhattan, 51 Christopher Street, and it was a very important place for the gay pride, the LGBT rights, and it has been designated historical monument by President Obama in 2016. This is a participatory memorial. This is another aspect which is very interesting, especially for augmented memorials, meaning that you can feed it on a grassroots level, bottom up. The user can participate in enriching this augmented memorial.
And bringing them all together in a living monument.
We're gonna stand up and take our own rights into our own hands.
Stonewall made us a people. We all knew it was different now.
For everyone, everywhere, where we all can see the history and add our own.
Rainbow color, of course, very emblematic of the movement. And as you can see, you can retrieve archival materials, interviews, documents, newspaper articles, and you can have access to a database of information, which, as I said, you can directly enrich with your own personal story. This is another example, which is very recent, a COVID memorial in augmented reality, which again is something that you can personally participate to develop in adding your own story of people, of your family, friends, your beloved who fell victim of the pandemic. Augmented reality memorials can easily become a potential device for political intervention and political activism. This is the case of John Craig Freeman. He is an activist, and he developed an augmented reality memorial in order to commemorate the thousands of migrants who have met their deaths along the US-Mexico border in the attempt to cross the desert in search of work, search of a better life. So pointing the smartphone at one of the points where a death has been recorded, Freeman's app uses a GPS geolocation to display a calaca. We'll see it in a second. A calaca in AR. Calaca is a stylized skeleton according to the Mexican and even earlier Aztec tradition of the wooden effigies used for the Dia de los Muertos, the day of the dead. But actually the case I would like to focus on is offered by this group of activists, movers and shakers who have developed kinfolk. Kinfolk is monuments project which has to deal with the official history of the US and with an alternative way of telling this history.
In 2021, it's no secret that our statues, our money, even our textbooks have one thing in common. They're full of white male slaveholders. Movers and Shakers is launching Kinfolk, a free app featuring augmented reality monuments of black and brown figures we should have learned about in school. We've partnered with Netflix to include 4 figures featured in Amend the Fight for America, a docuseries that explores the legacy of the 14th Amendment. Now, the whole family can come together and bring monuments into your living room. You can make them life-size, read their bios, and discover hidden gems through our Kinfolk web archive. Download today in your app store.
So it's a case I would like to focus on because it is paradigmatic of an entire family of augmented memorials. This kinfolk case belongs to a typology that we could call reappropriation in terms of a resignification of the public space. It is a political move, but without having recourse to violent acts of iconoclasm, such as those cases very frequent in these last years of toppled statues of controversial white colonialist heroes triggered by so-called cancel culture or woke culture, as has happened in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, for example, Columbus is a very controversial, it has become a very controversial statue in the US in recent years. Instead of destroying it in Columbus Circle in Manhattan, you could just superimpose an augmented anti-hero. Here you see Toussaint Louverture, who was an African-American revolutionary who made a fundamental contribution to Haiti's independence from France. So this is a way to produce a sort of anti-monument, non-monument in my terms, which at the same time preserves the previous monument to Columbus, but challenges the commemoration of a frozen past, which is one of the functions of traditional monuments. They freeze the past in a consolidated meaning. They tell a narrative of values, of the construction of memory. They imposed, in a way, a shared memory because they structure and articulate the public space in which we live. In this case, we have an alternative reading of history also complying with educational aims, because when you superimpose Toussaint Louverture or other anti-heroes of the anti-colonialist movement or anti-slavery, you can retrieve biographical information, historical information from the app. But at the same time, this kind of strategy has also received very strong criticism. It has been criticized as a kind of armchair activism, which allows you to be safe in your comfort zone without needing to confront the risks of an actual physical protest in the physical space. Bodily struggle with the police, with protesters, or other ideological parties, etc. So is it a way to deal with what is called difficult heritage, controversial heritage, without having to destroy it materially, which might be an interesting option for the preservation of ancient monuments, which are nevertheless controversial in their ideological or political or ethical content? But on the other hand, is this actually activism or artivism, as it is sometimes called, or is it just a way to stay in a comfort zone without having to risk anything actually for our lives? I will move to some examples in the city in which I teach, Milan, also to offer you some examples of artivism, activism through artistic projects. This is a statue on the left devoted to Thomas Sankara, a charismatic leader in the revolution of Burkina Faso. He was assassinated in 1987. So a social collective, Cantiere, promoted the installation of a statue devoted to Thomas Sankara, realized by the Senegalese sculptor Mor Talasek. But actually, they didn't ask for permission in order to install this statue. So the statue was promptly removed the following day by the authorities, by the police. But the antagonists didn't give up and substituted the actual material statue with an augmented statue, the statue that does not exist.
Oggi abbiamo inaugurato la statua che non c'è, il monumento alla rimozione del colonialismo, involontariamente realizzato da chi ha rimosso la statua di Sankara ai giardini pubblici di Porta Venezia. La statua di Sankara è sostituita da un punto di domanda. Il punto di domanda è un marker che, inquadrato con l'app ArtiVive, consente di vedere la statua, in attesa che chi l'ha sequestrata la restituisca. Ma il punto di domanda rappresenta anche le tante domande scomode che si vogliono rimuovere insieme alla memoria e al presente dell'oppressione coloniale.
So this is actually, as you have seen, a political move both against the history of colonialism and against the authorities of the city of Milan, which have removed the statue devoted to Thomas Sankara. In the very same garden, a statue was erected commemorating a very important figure in the intellectual landscape of contemporary Italy, but also a very controversial one. Vito Tongiani, a sculptor, realized the bronze statue devoted to journalist Indro Montanelli in 2006. Why controversial? Because Montanelli, as you may know, is considered one of the fathers of Italian modern journalism. Excuse me. But he was also a fascist officer during the war in East Africa in the 30s. During this war, he bought a 12-year-old girl, Fatima. She has different names according to different narrations that Montanelli himself offered of the story, as his wife. And he never distanced himself from this act, which was understandable on the one side, according to the customs of the Italian officers of the fascist army at the time, but not certainly justifiable in ethical terms afterwards. So he used to speak in interviews about this episode of his life in ironic terms, but not actually realizing that this had ethical implications, which were very serious. And in a famous interview, a feminist activist raised her criticism, strong criticism against Montanelli. So this statue has become a recurrent target of protests. It has become, in itself, it's in my opinion, from an aesthetic point of view, pretty an ugly statue, modeled on a famous photograph of Toscani, who had depicted Montanelli while writing on his typing machine in the corridors of the journal, of the newspaper Il Corriere della Sera, very close to the place in which the statue was erected. There's a gate against which the Brigate Rosse, the terrorists in the 70s, had shot Montanelli in the legs. So he was a victim of Brigate Rosse terrorism, and it was gambizzato, as we say in Italian. But this statue has become, as I said, a target during the day, the 8th of March, because of his attitude towards women, and in particular towards this little girl in East Africa in the 30s. So, for example, in 2020, collective of antagonists, Lume has covered the statue with red paint and added the caption, racist and rapist, on the basement of the statue. In the very same year, another artist and activist, Cristina Donati Meyer, has augmented, in a way, which is not a digital way to augment the statue, but a material way to augment the statue, with a puppet. So she entitled this intervention, "The Old Man and the Little Girl." And Diana Spaghetto Manfredi, a director and activist, decided to go augmented, to intervene, to reappropriate the meaning of the statue, inflecting a different semantic nuance, producing a filter for your smartphone, so that if you point this filter to the statue, you can see the statue transforming itself into the statue of a little girl. The case of Montanelli is, in my view, very interesting, because it offers us the example, the paradigmatic example of a memorial as a commemoration machine and a field of forces, a field of conflicts. It also suggests us to understand commemoration and monumentality not in an atomistic and isolated way, focusing on the single memorial. The sculpture that you see in the middle by Cristina Donati Meyer, this addiction, this augmentation of the original statue by Vito Tongiani, was removed by the authorities, but Cristina Donati Meyer has reproduced. Ulrich spoke of facsimile and reproductions in his introduction, has reproduced the very same statue with the doll representing this little girl. And this reproduction has been hosted in the Mudec, a museum which is funded by the city of Milan, an institution funded by the city of Milan. So the very same institution, authority, the city, which sends the guards, the police, in order to clean the red paint, to cancel the caption racist, rapist, to take away the doll as a material augmentation of the statue, is the very same city which sustains and supports a museum of cultures, Mudec, which hosts and preserves the replica of the same statue with the little doll. So this, I think, invites us to consider monumentality and commemoration as a Gestalt field. Gestalt in the sense of an urban public space, a shared space in which you have conflictual forces which live together, and sometimes they harmonize, sometimes they go one against the other in the very same public space. One might smile at the frivolous gamification of the case studies I have presented. However, I believe that these games should be regarded as serious games, should be taken seriously. From phenomenological point of view, I have stressed so far the differences between virtual and augmented technologies, and consequently between virtual and augmented memorials. Because, as I said already many times, from a phenomenological point of view, the feeling of being there is predominant. Being there is the formula which is always repeated in order to qualify and characterize your personal experience, because in teleportation, this bilocation that you experience, not only you feel yourself present there in another place, in another space, and this challenges what is called in technical terms the deictic center. The deictic center meaning the center of deixis, of monstration, the center which is my body, and it is with reference to my own living body that I can say here and there. But if my body is here and I feel myself there, you understand that the conflict is open between these two potential deictic centers, because one part of me sends to my brain information of proprioception about my being here. I have not moved from my room where I am having my virtual experience, but nevertheless, I feel there. I feel that I am present in another space, in another world. Phenomenologically, again, from the point of view of the personal experience, in augmented reality, this does not happen, because you stay here, you are aware that you are here, you are aware of your surroundings, of your peripersonal space, of other people in the environment, but this environment becomes augmented with a digital object which appears in this space. What happens if we move from a phenomenological experience to the ontological level? That is to say, if we address the question of the being of this object, of the nature of this object. I was very happy to hear Ulrich speaking in his introduction of digital materiality. Digitale Materialität, you said, because I think that this narration that digital culture is a dematerialization of our experience is totally inconsistent. The digital is a specific way of being material. Otherwise, your smartphone would not protest saying, give me some space because I have no more space to stock your pictures. If my digital pictures were really immaterial, my smartphone would never protest against the fact that there is no more space left. It's a res extensa in philosophical terms, even if of a specific nature. But from the ontological point of view, the virtual has a very long history. Not only the history of the 360 degrees is very ancient because you have, as I said, the stereoscopes. We could mention the panoramas, of course, in the 19th century. We could go back to the camerae pictae in the Renaissance, like the camera of the giants in Palazzo Te in Mantova, or we could take into consideration the illusionistic tradition of the trompe-l'œil, which introduces the image as if it were not an image. You don't have an image consciousness, so you think that the image belongs to the actual environment. As happens when you wear a headset and you encounter you being present there, the presence of another object in the very same space. But also the virtual as a term has a very long history in our culture, dating back to scholasticism in the Middle Ages, virtus, which translated the Aristotelian term dynamis, potentia. So what is dynamis, what is potentia, is a set of potentialities depending on the materiality. A tree is made of wood. This is dynamis in order to become a chair or a desk or a window or whatever. So it's the fact that the tree is made of wood, so its materiality, which can become a different form, which can assume a different form. In this sense, these programs in virtual reality, but also in augmented reality, and this is a feature which these two polarities share. I have stressed the opposition, but on this level, they share this aspect. They are potentialities which you, every time that you execute the program as a user, you actualize them. So the dynamis becomes act. And every time it becomes act in a different way. It becomes an event. Every time I execute the program, every time I decide to take a specific vantage point, a specific visual angle in this specific program. How this property, this dialectics between virtuality and actualization, is executing a program, how this differs or does not differ from, say, the score of a symphony. The score of a symphony is a script. You could perhaps compare it to the program of the VR or the AR object. The score is every time played differently by different orchestras, coordinated by different directors, but also by the very same orchestra in 2 different evenings, for example. You recognize the same only in the variation, which is a very Goethean, I would say, morphological concept. You have a theme, but the theme is always given, only given in its variations. It's never given in itself. There's no symphony number 5 in itself, because the score assures the identity of the work, but the score is not the symphony. You need to execute the symphony in order to have the symphony. But every time you execute it, this is a problem very well illustrated by Nelson Goodman. Every time you execute it, you have, in a way, a different object, which is at the same time the same. What happens to a painting? Is it true that, as Goodman said, the Mona Lisa is at the Louvre, whereas the Symphony number 5 is nowhere? It's in a way in the score, in the notes, in the script, but at the same time, it is not the symphony. It is the condition of possibility for the execution of the symphony. Or, on the contrary, even in front of the Maya desnuda or the Maya vestida, in this very funny and ironic photograph by Elliot Erwitt, the men are all in front of the desnuda. Also in paintings, also in front of paintings of photographs, the same happens. Like, for example, the aesthetics of reception would claim that every time I encounter the same object, but every time the meaning, the sense happens as a different event. There is a nature of evenementiality, we could call it, to characterize our experience. So where do AR and VR place themselves in this system of arts? I think that the question remains open, and I leave it for further discussion on the contemporary system of arts, perhaps tomorrow, if you are willing to, and you would like to address this. Zum Schluss, I try to switch to German, even if my German has become a bit like Latin. My oral German is not so good, and this is why I spoke to you in English tonight. Aber zum Schluss möchte ich noch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch sagen. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, vor diesem Publikum im Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte zu sprechen. Ich kam vor 30 Jahren zum ersten Mal an dieses Institut, als ich noch Student der Universität Mailand, Student der Ästhetik und Kunstwissenschaft war und entdeckte seine wunderbare Bibliothek. Heute als Panofsky-Professor zurückzukehren, ist besonders berührend und aufregend. Panofsky war für mich immer ein ständiger Anreiz zum Denken. Mein Mentor, Guido Davide Neri, hatte im Alter von nur 26 Jahren die erste Ausgabe Panofskys theoretischen Schriften aus der deutschen Zeit herausgegeben, die theoretischen Schriften. Diese italienische Ausgabe, La prospettiva come forma simbolica e altri scritti und andere Schriften, wurde sogar noch früher veröffentlicht als die deutsche. 1961. Hier finden Sie einen Brief von Panofsky an Guido 1960, in dem Panofsky sich freut, das ist im Nachlass Guidos an der Universität Mailand. Panofsky freut sich, dass seine anti-Heideggerschen Ideen im Logos-Artikel wieder veröffentlicht werden. Hinweis auf den Artikel Beschreibung und Inhaltsdeutung. So, ich widme diesen Vortrag an Guidos Andenken und vielen, vielen Dank.